I think Max is a bit more desperate now than he probably was before because of the fact that he knows the car doesn't have the pace. I think Red Bull was very stable at high speed and then started packing on downforce to try to get to low speed performance. And then ultimately this year found that aero instability point. And I know this happened because I talked with guys in the Red Bull aero side and they confirmed that they decided to go down a path that hasn't materialized. It wasn't until Max now started complaining that the engineers are like, oh, okay, there is a problem here. Would it help to have somebody like Adrian Newey around helping you find where the problems are and find solutions? 100%. There's no way anybody could deny that. I know we all want to think about what Red Bull has done cheating wise to make them fall back, but just look at the performance gains we've had across the entire grid. It's mega. I think the Checo will be out next year. I think if anything, it's going to come down between Yuki and Liam for who's going to take that seat. The listeners can find me on my X page, which is Dr_Obbs.
It's been a pleasure for me to talk to Dr. Obbs. We're recording this on a Friday night. I started the call feeling a bit, it's been a long week at work, but I leave it fully energized and I don't know what I'm going to do with that energy. Welcome to the latest episode of Georgie's Stripping the Dipping podcast. I'm your host, F1 Black. And this week we welcome back a member of an elite club. Dr. Obbs, PhD in fluid mechanics and all-around nice guy, has appeared in seasons 1 and 2, and today here he is in season 3. And if we talk about another season for a moment, the 2024 Formula 1 season, really there's only been one story. What has happened to Red Bull? This time last year, Red Bull won all but one of the Grand Prix and set a record for consecutive race wins. We were talking MP4-4 levels of dominance. But now, or at least at time of recording, Max Verstappen had failed to win a race in 10 Grand Prix. So who better than a man with a PhD in fluid mechanics, a fan of Red Bull, and a host of his very own podcast, more on that later, to unpack what's happened to the team from Milton Keynes. So, without further ado, Dr. Obbs, how are you doing?
Doing great, Black. It's been a while since we spoke. Yeah, you're right. That was a pleasure doing the Jos Capito session. So I guess we're kind of co-hosting this one.
Yeah, let's co-host it. That's good. Well, look, just for the sake of some of our maybe newer listeners, tell them who you are. Introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'm at the core of myself, just an F1 fan, really. I'd say motorsports fan in general because I do like all different forms of motorsports. Don't just bias myself to just one. But really, my enjoyment of motorsports began through my love of engineering and technical things. So I am an engineer, as you said. I have my PhD in fluid mechanics, fluid dynamics, and that's really where aerodynamics and everything. Because it's funny, I was I don't know if you know Denny Hamlin, who's a NASCAR driver, but Denny Hamlin mentioned me on his podcast and how he liked. I'm not bragging about myself, but how he liked to follow me. And they were looking me up, and somebody was like, "Well, who is he?" And somebody goes, "He's got a PhD in fluids." And then they were like, "Well, how does he know anything about aero?" But it's air is a fluid. So, so aero naturally very closely aligns with my interests. So that's really how I got into aerodynamics and my love of aerodynamics. And Formula One is just such a playground for aerodynamics. So from my side of things, I've been a fan of motorsports for a very long time. I'm on X at Dr_Obbs and just started tweeting one day about aerodynamics and then just kind of took off from there. I also co-host a podcast called Breaking Bias and sometimes get offered the opportunity to host Stripping the Dipping. So I'm in good company here.
But you were just mentioning your podcast, Breaking Bias, and we had Molly on the show earlier this season. So how's that going? And am I right in thinking that you had F1 Mech on the show more recently?
Yes. Yeah, things are going great. Breaking Bias for us is a very intentional podcast because Molly is an amazing woman in motorsports, technical field. We've talked, a lot in the motorsport spaces about equality, whether it's race equality, gender equality within technical spaces. And, it's called Breaking Bias because we want to break a lot of the biases that there are out there about technical fields and motorsports. Like I said, Molly's an amazing person, female in technical background, but also breaking the biases of different motorsports categories. Although we do really love Formula One, so when given the opportunity to interview and talk with Callum Nicholas, F1 Mech, we took it. Callum is just such a brilliant lad, and we enjoyed it so much because he has so much experience and worldview on how things go, not just in Formula One, but the role that he plays, as a person of color in motorsport space and technical background, and the voice that he has. It really was an amazing conversation. If anybody wants to go check, I'm going to plug my podcast real quick. If anybody wants to go check that out, it's Breaking Bias, breaking like BRAKING, and Breaking Bias podcast. You can find it on Spotify and place else. It was a great conversation.
It's absolutely fine. It was in the script. You're allowed to give a plug. Maybe we'll let you do that later as well. But no, it's lovely to have. It was lovely to have Molly on the show, and it's great the work that you do. And indeed, when we spoke to Molly, thinking about not just bias in terms of diversity of someone's sort of gender or ethnicity, but also trying to break down the barriers for people that perhaps don't always come from a technical background or feel a bit nervous about going, I don't understand that. So Molly does a great job of breaking things down and explaining them as well.
Absolutely. And, that's the thing is that anybody can get into the discussions, on technical topics and things. There's a whole host of information out there for anybody. That's the beauty of the world that we live in right now. There's a lot of bad things, but there's a lot of great things as well. And the beauty of the world we live in right now is the access to information and the availability of knowledge that's out there. You used to have to go to a library, pick up a book. Now you've got all the content that's out there on the internet. You've got video content that people put together. I've had the opportunity to be able to work with and discuss a few things with Formula One media members who I have contacts with that will talk about different technical topics, or other creators who have questions about aerodynamics for videos they might be making. And so I think it's great. I love sharing the love, honestly. None of this feels like competition to me. It just feels like the purpose should be to get information out there, to grow people's understanding, and people who truly are passionate about it just feed it. That's what it's all about. And that's why I love coming on this podcast and other podcasts as well, because I feel like it's an opportunity to do that.
For sure. And, I hope that I'm mellowing in my sort of Twitter old age, because today's show, maybe I wouldn't have wanted to approach this subject as a kind of embittered 2021 Lewis Hamilton fan. But actually, this season for me, one of the most interesting stories or themes is all about Red Bull. So we're recording this for the sake of continuity just after sprint qualifying. And it was a McLaren lockout on the front row. Max Verstappen managed to get fourth, I think, and Checo Perez outside the top 10. Let's not talk about Lewis Hamilton. But if we go to the beginning of the season, and certainly if we look back through a couple of seasons before, they've had the dominant car. I can see, although we're not recording video, behind you, you've got some sort of Max Verstappen model.
Yeah, I have a Max Verstappen model. I also have a Lewis Hamilton. I do like fine. Lewis Hamilton as well. And then I have an Aston Martin DB5. So I'm a huge Aston Martin James Bond fan. So I've got the whole
you got it covered
portion of the grid there.
That's fair. Okay, right. So we're all for equal representation. So, I mean, simple question, difficult answer. What's happened to the car dominance of Red Bull?
Yeah, great question. Very difficult answer. I'm going to give you my opinion, and it's just purely my opinion. I do know people across the grid in various like aerodynamics roles or aerodynamicists or even like, people in the pit lane. And I think it's funny because when I talk to the people in Red Bull, I think that obviously they're tight-lipped. They don't want to tell me a lot of things, but there are some things that I gather. And then you talk to people from other teams, and they have their opinions. But I think none of these things align. Everybody has their own idea. So there's a high chance that my opinion might not align with reality as well. But I'll tell you what I think. So obviously, since 2022, when the car came, you can't even really say that the car came out of the box fast, honestly, because Ferrari was the fastest at the start of 2022, and Red Bull had reliability issues in the first few races, had a couple DNFs. After they got over those reliability issues, there was the whole flexi plank thing, and it seemed like Ferrari dropped off somewhere along the way. Red Bull then kind of had a real strong rest of the year. We all know how 2023 went. It was probably an incredibly boring season if you're not a Red Bull or Max Verstappen fan. But certainly, winning all as Red Bull, winning all of the races except one there in Singapore, meant for quite an utterly bit of dominance, right? But I think now looking into 2024, the first half of the season, again, starting out dominant. And so what has happened? I went back and I looked at the data, and the way that I looked at it was I looked at the gap to the next closest constructor. And that just simply means if if P2 closest was Sergio Perez, I omitted that. I looked past that because we wanted to look at the next closest constructor. And what I saw is that as 2022 started, it was close. Then the gap grew in 2022 to the next closest constructor. In 2023, the gap started out again very big. And then the last half of 2023, the gap starts closing. And it was very interesting because it began with McLaren's upgrade in Silverstone last year, that the gap starts kind of incrementally sort of closing. And I remember because I was at the Silverstone race and I thought, holy cow, this qualifying is amazing because it was so close. And I was like, oh my, like we're starting to get some actual competition. And so that's when I saw that it started to happen. And then after that, at the start of this season, the Miami upgrade, of course, McLaren didn't roll out a brand new car, almost, let's call it, sort of like with sweeping changes like Red Bull did, where they went to the shark bite, the overbite sort of intake, and that was like massive. Everybody said, "Whoa, that's so innovative." McLaren kind of slow played their upgrade, and then Miami, boom, big upgrade, big performance. I think what's happening here is that you're seeing exactly the intention of the way that the regulations are written to try to close the grid up by limiting the amount of aerodynamic testing that you have when you're high up in the constructors list. So we all know that this is an aerodynamically dominated regulation set. As we saw from the start of the year, where there was a lot of aerodynamic instability and bouncing, and a lot of teams had to sort of work their way out of that. Red Bull didn't really have that problem from the start. So all these other teams are finding their way out, including McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari, all the top teams now found their way through it. I truly think that going through that process, where they say that when you go through the fire, you kind of go through the trials of life, that you just become so much better of a person. I think that same parallel can be there for technical development and technical teams as well. I think when you go through the fire, when you go through the trials, and you really have to button down and understand your car, I think you gain a lot of understanding and a lot of knowledge that maybe Red Bull didn't have when they didn't have to go through all that stuff. On top of the fact that they had reduced aerodynamic testing time, they had the cost cap penalty, which emphasized or made that problem even worse in 2023. Everybody was saying, look, the impacts are not really going to be there in 2023. It's probably going to knock on in 2024. And I think that's truly what we're seeing. The regulations are working as they're intended. It's brought the field up closer, a lot closer. It's brought the team that was P1 for a while back as a result of that. And I also think Red Bull took a misstep. I think in their development, they started chasing peak downforce along the way. As like I said, in 2023, the gap started kind of closing a little bit. I think they diverted from what they had been doing in the past, which was just trying to find a very stable, well-performing car, and started to chase peak downforce. And I think that got them into trouble.
That makes a lot of sense. I think the general trend that the field's getting closer together, and as you say, it started before the beginning of this season. But it's really interesting, when you look at how Max Verstappen and Checo Perez did at the start of the season. So Max basically won or finished first. Sorry, finished first or retired in each of the first 5 races. He got another P2 in Miami. He came first in Imola. Another 2 wins, albeit a tricky weekend in Canada. But it's since the end of the Spanish Grand Prix, he's not been on the top spot. So we're looking at 10 races? It just seemed like a huge drop-off. I guess throwing a more controversial and less technical question to you, although I guess it is technical in terms of management. We know that next season, Adrian Newey will be moving on. And we also know that Jonathan Wheatley has a new job coming up. So do you think the loss or future loss of big characters, big talents like that will already be having an effect on morale and performance, or is that kind of just speculation?
I think when you have somebody of the caliber of Adrian Newey, it would probably be illogical to believe that there's not an impact. I mean, I think there must be, right? Although, like I said, I do know some people who work at Red Bull, and I know that Adrian's, how do I say this, his influence on the team has been kind of slowly reducing as time has gone on. And I think they've been thinking about succession planning for a while. Because, I think it was 2023 where they really had to kind of convince, or maybe it was 2024 at the start of the season, where they really had to kind of convince Adrian Newey to stay interested. They gave him the RB17, right? I think project that he was working on that's been rolled out recently as sort of a side project to kind of keep his interest and keep him involved. From what I hear, he was very heavily involved in that project, and was still around, obviously, the team, but more in like an advisory role, and less so in, say, the role that he took in planning and developing the 2022 car, which was much more involved from what I hear. So I think they've naturally kind of been on their own for probably longer than what his departure would say. But no doubt, the issues they're in now, would it help to have somebody like Adrian Newey around helping you find where the problems are and find solutions? 100%. There's no way anybody could deny that. So I think if anything, the impact that his departure is having probably is that it's just increasing the duration and the length of them finding their way out of the situation that we're in. There's nothing simple about these cars. They're incredibly complex. And so you can find your way into areas of high downforce in the simulation space and even in the wind tunnel that just simply aren't there on the track because you can't mimic real life in simulated environments. So it's a perpetual struggle for engineers in general. It doesn't matter if you're in Formula One or whatever you're in, you try to, as much as possible, de-risk whatever you're doing in virtual space before you get to the real world. And you just can't simulate everything, every variable.
Well, as someone that's followed the fortunes of Mercedes closely and felt the pain, the statement that you can't simulate the real world hits home. So
Yeah.
Completely get it. I mean, moving away from aero very quickly, we can come back to it. There was a change to the technical regulations during the summer break around braking. So essentially, the regs used to say, or still say, the brake system must be designed so that within each circuit, the forces applied to the brake pads are the same magnitude and act as opposing pairs on a given brake disc. So it's talking about some symmetry there. But then they added in the summer, any system or mechanism which can produce systematically or intentionally asymmetric braking torques for a given axle is forbidden. So it's almost
Mhm.
like they thought that someone, question mark, had within the original rule found a way around it. And so they've had to be very, very explicit that any deliberate asymmetric braking system is illegal. There was speculation at the time that the team in question was Red Bull. Now, I don't think anyone has confirmed either way, but have you heard any more about that rumor? And could there be a link there between the drop off of Red Bull and what we see now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be very easy to explain the drop off if it was related to that. But I think when you look at the way that it happened, for me, A plus B doesn't equal C. It's kind of like there's that sort of a thing would really help you in low speed performance. And that's where Red Bull for the longest time has been absolutely terrible compared to the rest of the grid. So if they had something, they were doing it really poorly because they were not getting any value or benefit out of it. I think the other thing is obviously, as I talk to people within the team, and even when I talk to people on other teams as well, I've never picked up on from anybody, even from the other teams, that said like, "Oh yeah, Red Bull has this kind of a thing, and this is what they're doing." People just all passed it off as like, rumor and gossip and things like that. I think that what happens with these sort of corrections and changes is that the FIA is always looking at the regulations and talking with the teams. And one of the things that the teams do, and a good example of this is with the W13 when it first came out, and there was that cis wing, if you recall, that kind of jutted out from the side of the side pod, and they called it cis wing mirror stay because the mirror was attached to it. And it was a brilliant bit of engineering, and it was a brilliant way to find like gray areas within the regulations to create a structure that did something that you wanted it to. But before they did that, they more than likely, and most teams do this, would have checked with the FIA with respect to, look, is this something that's going to get, is this totally out of the realm and the rules? And, if it is so, then we won't do it. So teams will do that. They will ask the FIA for some clarification on things. Sometimes that triggers a clarification because then the FIA looks at that and says, "Oh, that's a gray area. If you do that, we will slap your wrist. We're going to correct we're going to correct the regulation." So that's one way. So obviously another way is that they find something that a team is running. And then the third way is that sometimes a team will be aware that another team is maybe looking into something or studying the possibility of using something. And but because personnel move from teams all the time, and the IP and the information that's in their brain is not protected. So when they go to a new team, they take that information with them. And if they do that, then they come to a new team and tell the new team, "Hey, Red Bull's working on this thing, or Red Bull is considering this thing." And then they go to the FIA and say, "Hey, there's a gray area here. You need to close up this regulation set or whatever, this part of the regulation set." So any number of those things could happen, and sometimes teams will preemptively do that to block their competition from doing something that they're hearing that they're doing.
God, it's like a mix between sport, engineering, and then, I don't know, debate club, where you're trying to kind of get your counter arguments in first. Yeah, exactly.
It's strategy. And you mentioned, Jonathan Wheatley. I mean, from a legal and strategic perspective, I mean, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Man was offered an incredible position, so he's going to go take that position. And there was when he moved, then there was all these like media articles about, "Oh, well, what is going on in Red Bull? It's a toxic environment." And when I go talk to my friends, and they're like, "No, he got offered a promotion. Why would he not take it?" Like everybody here was like incredibly happy for him, and still are happy for him. He's still with the team till the end of the year. So it's like, but that's just kind of our sport, right? Is that like I think today's a great example. The McLarens over a short lap were 0.25 seconds faster than everybody else. And so the first thing that pops into your brain is, what are these guys doing that somebody else is not doing? Because that's so fast. It's human nature, I think, for us to always think like somebody's doing something that's not right, that's not true. Like, and if there's a rumor that comes out there, everybody jumps on it immediately, and that's our sport. It's been that way for the longest time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why my brain just connected this, but I was talking in my day job about managing people and sadly managing certain individuals that are not performing particularly well. And when you talk to those people, they won't just think, "Oh, I'm not performing well. It's just objective that I'm underperforming." They'll think I'm being treated unfairly, or
Yes,
somebody else is the golden child, or someone has this advantage. So you're right. It's kind of human nature to create that narrative in your head. It's more convenient. It feels more, comfortable. For sure.
definitely. And there's no doubt that there are teams on the grid that just simply don't like each other for whatever reason. I think drivers usually get along very well. I mentioned Callum. And Callum is. I think we even talked about it on the podcast. I mean, you know, there's a lot of them. He's got friends in Ferrari and friends in Mercedes and stuff. It's like the people that are there on the weekends, they're all happy and friendly with one another. There's just some people in certain positions across different teams that just don't like each other, and they will look for any. And then when the competition ratchets up too, oh, now it's like it's on. They're looking for any way that they can, slow their competition. And it's like business in general. Just business is like that, right? You doesn't matter what business you're in, you're always looking for ways to accelerate your position and hinder the position of your competition.
I mean, as you say, it's strategy. I love watching the racing and the driving and the competition on track, but there's competition off track, and that's what Formula One has always been. So let's talk a bit about what happened just before the US Grand Prix. Again, perhaps a storm in a Twitter Cup or X Cup, but it transpired, I think, that Red Bull admitted they were a team that had a device that, in theory, would enable them to alter the height of the bib, which I think is the
Yes.
front splitter just behind the axle in front of the floor, but you can
Yes,
tell us.
just underneath the driver. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, right. And that they could do that potentially in parc fermé conditions. And the speculation was that this could confer some aerodynamic advantage depending on the conditions and so on. So, I mean, could you
Yeah.
tell our listeners, using that sort of PhD and fandom of yours, what is the advantage that they could get, and perhaps whether you believe the story that actually it probably isn't possible to change, given the position of that adjuster?
Yeah. So the bib, yes, is the front portion of the floor that splits, where the air splits and it goes under either side of the floor. It's directly underneath the driver. Within the bib is like a spring kind of damper sort of structure. And the reason for that is because the very front of the plank, which is the piece that extends from the front all the way to the back, is attached to the bib. It's directly underneath the bib, the front portion. And that's the first part of the floor. So the plank is the lowest portion of the floor. It's called Z0. So it's Z is the direction up and down on the car, from the bottom of the car to the top of the driver's head and top of the wing. And Z0 is your datum. It is the plank. That's where it must lie as per the regulations. Um, the bib is attached to that. The floor body is attached to that. So anything that you could do to change the angle or the location of the front of that plank by adjusting the bib could give you, and I'm talking millimeters, half a millimeter, adjustments, could give you slightly a bit more angle, so that when you come and contact the curb, because that's going to be the first thing that's going to contact the curb when you go over a curb, could give you just a little bit more room to strike that curb, hit the bib, which you then have the spring and damper to actually absorb some of the load, and then now have the plank kind of hit it. versus if it's, at the z=0 position and you want to run the car very low because the cars go much faster the lower that they are, then you could get into a situation where you're striking that bib much more. And then the ride quality is not very good. You could potentially damage the floor as a result of those curb strikes. So if you had a way that you could set that up differently between qualifying and the race, then that could be the advantage, is that you could wholly run the car lower than you would if you didn't have that adjustment, because now you're counteracting the chance of that increased floor strike with a little bit of millimeter adjustment for height change. So you're not striking it as hard. The value of that, as I said, is that you can run low and the car can go a lot faster. Now, on heavy fuel and low fuel, the car sits completely differently. So that's the nuanced part of this, is that the only time that this would make sense, number one, regulations do not allow you to change the location of the plank from z=0. So if you do change the height of that thing, an angle by any distance that makes it different from z=0, then you're already out of the regulation. So you would be illegal. And the open question I have, and I've talked to a couple other creators about that, is do they actually check Z0 on the cars after qualifying and after the race to make sure that every car is legal? We know they check the plank wear, right? Because we saw there was a few disqualifications because of plank wear. But do they actually check Z0? And interestingly enough, after COTA, when you go and you look at the post-race scrutineering, they did. They checked it. But when you go back and look before that, and credit to Molly checked this out for me, we saw in Singapore, they checked the floors. And there was a bit of rumor that this was first made known potentially to the FIA before Singapore about Red Bull. And so then when you went and you checked the post-race scrutineering, they checked Max's floor and basically the plank for Z0, and they scanned it all. So they did check it after Singapore as well. So that also gets me to the point that no, I do not think Red Bull was doing anything crazy with that, because it would have shown up in Singapore. And by the fact that in order to make the changes, you actually have to take panels off of the nose to get into the foot pedal box, and you actually have to remove some of the foot pedals, from what I heard, to actually get to the adjuster to do it, which would be very obvious, because if you've seen these cars in Parc Fermé, what they do actually after they get scrutineered after qualifying, they put them in they call it like a sock. It's like a car sock. It basically has a wrap. And you always see them, like when the teams, they'll put out the images and they'll say, good night, race tomorrow, or whatever. Mercedes does this, Ferrari does it, Red Bull, and it shows the car in the wrap sitting in the garage. That can't come off. It cannot come off until the next day, I think, at a certain time, and with an FIA person around. And once that comes off, the FIA person does not leave. The scrutineer does not leave the garage, does not leave the car's side until the race, and then until after race scrutiny. So from that side of things, I think it would be very difficult to make this kind of a change. Now, why would you have this kind of a change? Which is a good question. I think if you're just purely doing it to adjust not to adjust the angle, but to adjust the stiffness of the spring that's in there, and basically the stiffness damper ratio for curb strike reasons, then that would be a very easy and quick way to do it. Because from what I hear, the alternative way to do that is to actually take the floor off and then go and make that adjustment. So, which would take quite a lot of time. And if you could do this without having to take the floor off, and you could do it in free practice, then I see it as like just a point of efficiency. Like, if you wanted to do something quickly, make adjustments, it could just be as simple as that. Now, again, obviously, everybody jumps on this because, everybody wants to explain. I want to explain so much what has happened to the performance. It would be easy to use one of these things. but and I think that's what people are grasping for. But yeah, I don't think that's the case for Red Bull.
Okay, well, conspiracy theory thwarted or thrown away.
That's just my opinion, so.
No, but you make a compelling case, and it sounds incredibly informed. Perhaps the best explanation that feels to me like Red Bull wouldn't really be able to make adjustments in Parc Fermé, which is the point of the rules. But let's talk about Sergio Perez. We'll get onto Max and his fun with Lando this season in a minute. But I mentioned a bit earlier that Max has sort of won. How many races has he won? He's won 7 races. They just all happen to be in the first 10 races of the season.
Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, at the beginning of the season, Checo wasn't doing too badly. So it says here he came second in the first 2 races behind Max.
Mm-hmm.
And he came second again in Japan, so race 4, and then again on the podium, third in China. It's just that he hasn't been back on the podium since then, which is race 5. So would you say a lot of this is just down to the other cars catching up to Red Bull and Max just being a bit superhuman in terms of the performance he can get out? Is there something about the way the car needs to be driven to get the best out of it? What do you think we can put Checo's fall off today?
I think there's a couple things. I think this started in 2023, by the way. The gap started growing. And if you heard, Checo was complaining about the car was being developed away from him, and we were all just ignoring and not listening to him. And apparently, from what he says, the team was also not listening to him. The car development, I think, is partly to blame for this, because what they say is that I think it was from the Spanish Grand Prix in 2023, they took a decision and they rolled out an upgrade package that took them around the development track that they wanted to go. Because even in 2023, people were completely blowing off Christian Horner when he was saying this, but he was saying that the pack will close up, like it will happen. And I think they started to feel a little bit of pressure because, yes, they were fast, but they knew that the margins were getting closer. And they said, look, we need to find ways to develop the car to find more performance. They decided to take a path which started with the first upgrade package in the Spanish Grand Prix in 2023. And then from there took them down this path, which has brought them to the point where now not even Max can drive the car. I think we've heard for a long time that Max has this innate ability to get the most out of a car, and Checo struggles a little bit. He needs a car that's suited to him. Max can kind of drive around problems. I think Lewis Hamilton, very good at this as well, being able to sort of drive around problems and get the most out of the car, that he can. And it wasn't until Max now started complaining that the engineers are like, oh, okay, there is a problem here. And they started going into it and now have been very outspoken in public with, we took this decision to go down this path. And I know this happened because I talked with guys in the Red Bull Aero side, and they confirmed that they decided to go down a path that hasn't materialized. They will not tell me what that path is. I believe, this is just my opinion. My opinion is that I think that where, like I said before, when they had a really great car in high-speed corners, very stable, it was a high-speed package, which I think naturally benefited them for aero bouncing because they had a really stable package at high speed. And that's really where aero bouncing is triggered. They had that package and they said, look, we need to now attack low speed performance. And they did come out in 2023 saying that they were going to have upgrades. And I think Silverstone was one of the first places. We're going to have upgrades to attack low speed performance. And in order to do that, your downforce is a square velocity. Okay. So the slower you go, the more drastic your downforce falls off, right, with the square velocity. So in order to find performance, you have to find downforce at low speed, which means that your downforce at high speed is now all the more, right? So that's called like kind of chasing peak downforce or peak load. And this is where I believe that Mercedes got into trouble in 2022 was from the start. In the wind tunnel, this thing was like a downforce monster. but it was so unstable. And, the drivers didn't know what it was going to do from one corner to the next. So they had to literally completely start over, back everything off, and then sort of add it slowly and then get to where they are now. I think Red Bull was very stable at high speed and then started packing on downforce to try to get to low speed performance. And then ultimately this year found that aero instability point. And from that aero instability point, they're now trying to work themselves out of the position. But it is a bit more complex than that, because the aerodynamics are linked to the mechanical package as well. And if you recall what I said before, is that when other teams went through this aero bouncing issue, they had to study very intently the multi-phase dynamics between the aerodynamic performance and the mechanical platform performance in order to get bouncing out of the car, right? So I believe that McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren definitely. The people I talk to on the grid feel like McLaren has the most compliant chassis suspension on the grid, bar none. So they've done a lot of work in that area apparently, and this has naturally set themselves up to where now when you need to start to add downforce and couple that with stability, they've got a great suspension package and a wonderful chassis to align with that aero package to now make your combined ceiling a bit higher. Whereas I think Red Bull now was sort of like they had a good chassis, they had a good suspension for a while at the lower aero performance limits. But we know the cars are much faster than they were in 2022, right? And even 2023, you just look at the times for qualifying today compared to the last year, totally different. We were in the 108s, I think, right, today? Yeah, we were in the 108s, and it was like a 1010 something last year. That tells you, like, all credit, please, to these teams, to these people. I know we all want to, like, think about what Red Bull has done, like cheating wise, to make them fall back, but just look at the performance gains we've had across the entire grid. Like, it's mega. Like, please, credit to the people. So McLaren's done a fantastic job. Ferrari's done a fantastic job with their platform. I still think Mercedes is struggling a little bit to kind of the car just still doesn't seem like it's totally under the drivers today, which to me is, yeah, they're still finding their way. But there's nothing easy about any of these cars and the dynamics of them. And I've completely lost my train of thought of where I was going with this one, but I'm just trying to explain from the standpoint of Checo's performance now. That's where I want to go. Checo had a harder time dealing with the instability, and Max was driving around it. And I also think that as you start to fall so far back from your driver pair, you lose confidence. Confidence is so key. And then the other thing is, when Red Bull was so far out in front compared to the rest of the grid, the margin between Checo and Max was still like 4/10, 5/10. I mean, it wasn't super close. Now, if you look at the qualifying performance, 4/10 gap, that's like 8 places, because the grid has closed up so much. So I think it's combined effect. Red Bull has their part to play in this. Yes, 100%. They developed the car in the wrong direction. Checo has his part to play. He's not able to drive around the issues as well as Max is. And honestly, credit to the grid, who's closed up the gap. The margins are so fine now, and Checo cannot be that far off of Max. And Max has to literally drive the cars off the wheel, or drive the wheels off the car just to try to get it up to the top. He was P4 today. He was P1, last week? I think, right? Gosh, it's been a whole week. So I think he was P1 last week. No, it was P2. No, it was P2 last week. Yes, P2.
Gosh, time flies when you're got a triple header of Formula One. It's like, what week am I on? It's interesting you said that about Max being able to get incredible things out of a car, even if the package isn't working amazingly. And it reminds me, I can't remember when this interview happened, but Eddie Irvine said something similar about Michael Schumacher, because that was an era where they did a lot of testing. And I think Eddie Irvine's observation, and he's been known to sort of brag a little bit, but he sort of said, actually, it was tricky for Michael because he was so good at driving around problems for the data that he then was giving to the engineers to really show where the car needed massive improvements. Whereas obviously someone like Eddie, who's a good, solid driver, clearly he's not going to be able to drive around those. So it's interesting that maybe that's the new modern day equivalent. But you said Max has to kind of drive the wheels off the thing, and we've seen some really close racing, which, whether it's been controversial, has been really exciting. Almost as exciting as you found, the 2-second difference between quali last year and this year, and the brilliant engineering, and you wanted to sort of give them the shout out for all the work they're doing. So I think the first real tussle, as far as I can tell, was in Austria, and we saw what happened there. I don't think that requires further examination, moving in the braking zone, but then just neither wanting to yield. Then we had Austin, where at the hairpin, a couple of times, Lando was trying to overtake. The second time, he overtook round the outside, and he was given the penalty. And then in the most recent race, we saw sort of, again, both drivers come off the track. And Max, I would imagine, without sort of knowing for sure, he got frustrated. And at the next sort of major braking zone at high speed, he basically just threw it up the inside just to get the place back, and was given 2 penalties as a result. So what's your view on all of this? Do you think the stewards have been consistent? Do you think that Max kind of had matured, but actually the car trouble was annoying him? Or do you think actually he's just not really been under pressure until we got to the second half of this season?
Good questions. And I have to give you credit for that segue. That was a brilliant segue, Black. Really good segue into this question. I think from my side, so first and foremost, I enjoy close racing. Last year was boring. As a Red Bull fan, I kind of liked starting a race and not really having any of the butterflies at the start of the race, because I thought, okay, I think we're just gonna have the best pace no matter what. That was a good feeling. But it didn't feel like racing. I really do enjoy the fact that we now have close racing, and actually we can talk about these things. I think Max is a bit more desperate now than he probably was before, because of the fact that he knows the car doesn't have the pace. And so he has to really drive defensively. If he qualifies well, he knows the cars behind him have more pace. These guys are not under an illusion. The engineers, they know what's happening. They plot out the whole race in terms of performance that they've gathered from free practice running and race simulations and things like that, to where they think that the other teams will be from a pace standpoint. And the drivers know that. The drivers will be told, look, you punched above your weight. The 3 cars behind you have better pace than you. So do what you can to stay in front. And I think he's doing what he can to try to stay in front. I think with Lando in the last race is now more aggressive. He's playing the game. I think Max is brilliant at driving for the regulations. Is the stewarding consistent? No. It's never been consistent. And it never will be, as long as we have volunteers and stewards that change from race to race. It's human nature. It's like any sport, whether we're talking about proper football, and I mean UK football, not American football. And I can say that because I lived in Scotland for 3 years. If you look at proper football, I'm an Arsenal fan. Okay, let's not talk about the red cards that we had the past few matches. I mean, there's always, as long as there's humans involved, there's always going to be inconsistency. And I think from my standpoint, I've just gotten to a point to where I'm like, all right, it's part of the sport, it's part of football, it's part of racing. And the stewards are going to make mistakes. The stewards are going to interpret things differently from what I see as well. I hope that we don't get to a point, and this is whether we talk about technical regulations or we talk about sporting regulations and driving. I hope we don't get to a point to where everything is just so prescriptive that there's just no room for the human element, for the drivers to actually take charge and do something, for the engineers to take charge and innovate. innovation from a technical standpoint, I think we're all cool with. Everybody's like, yeah, we want innovation. I love seeing that little thingy on the car and talking about this thing. But then when it comes to innovation from drivers, that's their craft. That's their innovation, is how they defend, how they drive, how they send it up the inside. And some are more aggressive than others. Same thing in a technical development. Some are more aggressive. You saw McLaren pushing the limits in their mini DRS that was flexing. Okay, no one for a minute should pretend that wasn't intentional. It was intentional. It's engineered in. It's designed in to do that. And it's freaking brilliant. Like, it's amazing. And I'm getting very excited because I love these kinds of things. But I think the same thing about driving. When I look at Max, when I look at Lewis, when I look at, Leclerc, Charles Leclerc had some brilliant moves as well. I mean, Senna, Schumacher, Seb Vettel, like, name them off. The list is so long of drivers that are so innovative in their racing. And I do see Max as being one of those drivers as well. I think he can go over the edge. I think he went over the edge in Mexico. I think it came out of frustration. I think it came out of truly knowing that the car doesn't have the pace and he's just desperate to try to keep Lando behind. I think that's where that came from. So I think he was wrong in that one. But I think Max, one of the things that makes Max amazing too, because he's a lion, is that when he's on the track, he's literally like a lion. And then when he's off the track, he's a completely different person. And you'll hear other drivers say that too, is that in the car, he's like a demon, and off the track, he's totally chill and normal. And all the best drivers, I think, from what I've seen and following racing over the many years, is that all the best drivers are like that. When you put them behind the wheel, they go into like this other mode that the rest of us human beings, simple humans, cannot do. These guys can find that. Lewis can find that. Max can find that. All the best can do that. And I think the downside of that is sometimes this is what happens.
I think that's a hugely fair point. There are many sports where we see genius, and often at its extreme, that genius then tips over into whatever you want to call it. Could be called mania, could be called something else. In snooker, which is another sport you may have come across in Scotland, there's an English guy called Ronnie O'Sullivan who seems to have a God-given talent, but actually sometimes his behaviour is extremely bizarre. He might wake up in a bad mood and could concede the match, or suddenly be quite offensive to his opponent or whatever. I'm not putting Max up there, but certainly that passion and also that kind of being a really special driver, you're no doubt not going to be like the normal distribution, not going to be like the middle there. I guess on this innovation point, which is a really interesting way to look at driving, and I hadn't thought about that. Is your view then that perhaps we need to have slightly less regulation? So comparing it to football, soccer, whatever they call it, we have this thing called VAR, video assistant referee, which some people love, but a lot of people are saying, we thought this was going to make the decisions better, but actually it's over-analysing things. It's destroying the kind of spirit of the game. It's sort of destroying the flow. Do we want to see this many driving incidents going to the stewards, or do we want to see it sorted on track? What's your view about regulation moving forward on that side?
That's my concern. You've nailed it. Is that, like, you can take this only so far until now the players, the drivers, literally have to be robots. And, and anything that steps out of this robotic sort of lane is now violation. That's the extreme, but just to say that, like, it can go that direction to a point. We in American football, have video assisted referee, have the reviews. They have it in baseball, basketball. They have it in all the sports. And we were arguing for the longest time in American football and the NFL what constitutes a catch. And it's like, because you break it down into all the elements of a catch, and you need to have this and that, just not accepting that there's some level of like subjectivity in this human being that has to rule And it's okay to get it wrong sometimes. It doesn't have to be right 100% of the time. Um, and stewarding's going to be that way. But yeah, I'm just getting so concerned. There's a sort of a groundswell from the drivers. Is it a groundswell? It's not really coming from the ground up. Maybe it is from the driver's standpoint, but there's a groundswell of like opinion within the driver's base that they should just add a lot more gravel traps. And I do believe that traps are great deterrents for like track limits. Um, Also going to be a deterrent for this kind of on-track battle as well, right? Because you send it up the inside with no possibility to make the corner. If you're going into the gravel, you're gonna be less likely to do that. But then again, like I do kind of love the ones where it sticks, and a guy sends it up the inside and it sticks, or sends it up the inside and the guy on the outside who's getting passed sees it coming and does a switchback. For me, that's like racing, and I threw it out there on my ex, and I just got absolutely like bullied for it. But I threw it out there like the whole NASCAR. I say I love other motorsports, and I really do. And NASCAR is a great one, showing that the NASCAR guys are running at Coda. And in that same turn that Max and Lando clashed, like how far outside the track limits the NASCAR guys go. Now, to be fair to them, they have like 50% the downforce, if that Formula One cars do. So they need all this runoff to be able to make the corners and not have them be bricks around the track. But I love also that they kind of are a bit more liberal with track limits in certain areas and just say, sort it out. Like, don't take each other out, then you'll get in trouble. But sort it out. In these particular corners where we've got runoff, and it's the best place for passing. No track limits in this spot. Sort it out. Keep it on the hard stuff. And for me, like I'm a bit more aggressive from that standpoint. That is the direction, honestly, I would like to see us go. Is I would like to see us go a bit more liberal on the track limits to encourage these kinds of passes, to encourage this kind of on-track battle. Because I don't want to. We've already got cars. Sorry, I'm on my tangent, or I'm on my soapbox. We've got these cars that are too big for these tracks. Not enough people are talking about this. The cars are huge. The tracks haven't gotten any bigger. The track limits certainly haven't gotten any bigger. If anything, they're shortening DRS zones and they're tightening up the tracks, and the cars are still big. So how are these guys supposed to pass each other? And then on top of that, you're going to start adding all these gravel traps and reducing the runoffs. All that's going to do is make people less willing to make a move. And I'm just thinking, we need smaller cars. We need cars that allow people to fight, to battle. We need tracks that are suited for the cars. We need liberal track limits in areas that encourage passing and moves. And we need to let the guys sort it out on the track.
Well, let me make one slight dig at you, because why wouldn't I? But then agree with you on 3 points. So the dig is, okay. Max Verstappen fan, of course you love cars going into the runoff. But now let's be serious. I love a switchback. That is extremely satisfying. So I agree with you on that. I also agree with you that, the logic that putting gravel traps will improve things. I think there's a be careful what you wish for, because as you say, it will reduce the risk appetite for drivers. If you know that, okay, I'm going to get beached, my race will be over, or I'm going to lose a lot more time, I'm going to damage the car, then you'll get, okay, I'll play it a bit safer. And also, probably you're going to give the onus to whoever's on the inside to drive right up to, just drive up to the edge and run the guy off. So probably won't improve things. And as I agree with you, this car size point, people do not talk about it enough. I mean, look, I started watching 30 years ago. It was a sad year. I think it was a year a lot of people started watching when Senna and Ratzenberger passed away. But those cars were about 500 kilograms. And now what are they? Is it 800?
Yeah.
It's 60% growth.
Plus, more than that,
Yeah. So, and the tracks haven't gotten bigger. That's why when we see Monaco and we go, oh, Lewis Hamilton driving around on those worn tyres for the whole race. Yeah, because you can't get past. As much as I said it was a great drive. Yeah.
And that's my fear, Vlag, is like you look at the races like in Monaco and all these places where you can't pass, or the penalty for trying to pass is too steep. And it just becomes processional. And I'm like, I don't want that. my joy comes from seeing these on track battles, and yeah, um, and I am a Max Verstappen fan, but I'm a Red Bull Racing fan first. So actually, Checo's issues have been paining me for sure because we're third in the constructors, which I really care about. But at the end of the day, like um, I want to see these guys battle. I want to see them fight one another, and I think nowadays there's kind of this swelling of attitude that's sort of like I'm looking for any reason to be upset about something, especially in social media, because the algorithms in social media love drama and contentious points. And so if you post something that's like I'm upset about this or that I'm assessing this like controversial topic, those things play at so much a higher level and get so much more engagement and visibility because they're contentious. And I feel like our minds are kind of geared that way as well nowadays. That we're just looking for that thing to be angry about, or we're looking for that thing to go into someone's tweet and argue with them about. And so when these things happen, instead of focusing on and my guy loses some of the battles sometimes too. He lost last week, he got 20 seconds on him, which fine, he deserved it. Like, drink your tea and take that one, Max. I mean, because you earned it. So but it's like why not also look at it and go, man, okay, these guys are battling. Like, I like this much better than just a processional Monaco race that's incredibly boring, that nobody's doing anything, as long as they're not taking each other out. If there's intentional, like, I'm going to take you out and crash you because I don't want you to finish the race, yeah, we've got a big problem. Um, but if I'm just racing you hard, I mean, even Checo and Liam, raced each other really hard. Checo came on the wrong side of that one. um, I want to see more of that.
I couldn't agree more, which leads us to a really important question. So we've got 4 Grand Prix to go. We sit here on sort of the eve of the Sao Paulo Grand Prix, but we've got Las Vegas, we've got Qatar, and we've got potentially the decider in Abu Dhabi. The drivers at the front are split by less than 40 points, I think it is, between Max in first and Lando in second. We've spoken for much of the last hour about, Max Verstappen is essentially the hungriest guy because he doesn't know where his next meal is going to come from. He doesn't know when his car's going to have the chance to score big points. So if you had to bet your farm on the World Drivers' Championship, where do you think you'd put your money?
Ooh, good question. I think before today's race and seeing the pace of the McLaren, I would have said, yeah, 100% Max. I mean, easy. I think the gap is too big. I think here in Brazil, McLaren has a good chance to close the gap for Lando significantly. I still think, though, Max will come out on top. I think it will be very close. I know that, I've heard rumor that Red Bull will have a package for Las Vegas, an update package along the lines of now dialing out some of the instability and finding performance. But I think it's just going to be marginal at best. I don't think it's going to be anything major. So I think this track naturally suits McLaren very well. I think that Las Vegas will suit Red Bull really well, and maybe the Ferrari as well. I think McLaren, though, has been good at a lot of tracks, so they'll be, I think, good there again. But I think Max will have a better chance to keep the margins closer in Vegas, and then we've got Qatar, right, and then Abu Dhabi. So Qatar, I think, will suit the Red Bull well. I think it goes well there, and I think AD as well should. So I think if there's any chance for Lando to shrink the gap, it will be here in Brazil. Never has been, even though Max won last year, never has been a great track for this car. Something in the DNA of it for some reason. But yeah, so I think the rest of the races, though, Max will, barring any reliability issues or DNFs. Obviously, if there's a DNF, Max crashes out. Yeah, then I think Lando's got a great shot. But other than that, I think Max still brings it home.
Absolutely. Well, truth will be told. We will find out. And I suspect you could be right in that, Murphy's Law isn't quite this, because that's sort of anything that can go wrong will go wrong. But those points that Oscar took off of Lando earlier in the season, it just feels like the story would be complete if the championship battle came down to the wire and it was within the margin of those points. I think there's some sort of completeness to that. And you talked about the pain of being a Red Bull fan. I'd like to up the ante and say I was once a Mercedes fan, but you are third in the championship. So do you think in the constructors, that's it? That's all she wrote? Do you think it's going to be possible to get back on terms with at least the Ferrari, if not the McLaren?
No. I think we're third at the end of the season. And if there's any silver lining to it, and this is coming from me who does not get a paycheck from Red Bull, does not have any of my financial incentives tied to bonuses related to constructor standings. If there's any silver lining, it's that if there's any year that is critical for having aerodynamic development, it's next year. And they have been really struggling and suffering with their aerodynamic development credits because of their standings in the constructors for so long. And I think going down to P3 will gain them some very valuable credits for development for the 2026 car, which is going to still be a struggle for them no matter what at the end of the day, because it will be PU dominated. I think aero will play a big part of it as well. But I think it will be mostly PU dominated. They've got a big uphill battle to go with Red Bull powertrains for their own PU. But I think if there's any time that you would want to have those credits, I think it's going to be for next year. I just think that, Checo's lost a lot of his confidence. This could have been a good opportunity for Checo. Didn't make it into final round of sprint qualifying, unfortunately. So that'll be another hit for him. And then let's see what happens in actual qualifying in the race. But the car's just not under them right now compared to the rest of the grid, and I think deservedly so. Ferrari and McLaren are better than Red Bull right now, and they deserve to be in the constructor standings that they're in. And I think we'll end up P3.
So last proper question, and I know that you're kind of hinting that you want to predict what's going to happen in 2026, and we'll bring you back or listen to the Breaking Bias podcast to hear about that. But 2025, do you think Checo still in that prime Red Bull seat? I heard Liam Lawson say he's not here to make friends, he's here to win. Do you see any movement there, or do you think Checo's going to do what he says and see out the final year of his contract?
I think if I have a crystal ball, I think that Checo will be out next year, not based off of anything that I know, but just my opinion. I think that Checo will be out next year. I think if anything, it's going to come down between Yuki and Liam for who's going to take that seat. Yuki Tsunoda is getting a test in the Red Bull, I think at the end of the season, and they're probably going to use that. I think they brought in Liam for a very specific reason, to take over for Daniel mid-season like they did. Or not, it wasn't mid-season, past mid-season. Poor Daniel. I like Daniel. That was such a tough one. I was a bit annoyed at my team for that one. But yeah, I think Liam came in for a very specific reason, because they want to see where he's at. And now you've got Franco Colapinto, who's kind of all the rage in the paddock. You've got Christian Horner seen coming out of the Williams hospitality today. And I don't know if you heard what James Vowles said about it when they asked him. And James Vowles said, well, we just signed a new coffee partner and he came to try our coffee. It's like, come on, just taking the piss. It's hilarious. But yeah, so I think Franco Colapinto then is a real option for whoever moves from Racing Bulls to the second seat in Red Bull to be their replacement, which would be really interesting. They've also got Isaac Hadjar in the Red Bull Juniors program, who's formidable talent as well. So there's a few options there if Colapinto doesn't pan out. Sainz was always going to be the interesting one for me, though, Black. Like I felt like even mid-season that somehow, some way, the writing was kind of on the wall for Checo. That just the relationship is probably not great either behind the seats. I would think, not based off of anything I know, but I would think that the relationship must not be very good either. So maybe it's just not a long-term tenable kind of dynamic that you can sustain. And maybe it just makes more sense for Checo to move on and for them to bring some fresh blood into the team, into that second seat. Maybe that'll be good for Max as well. Somebody who can challenge him, somebody who can mentor that's a little bit younger, maybe, which might be another reason why Liam could be a good name there versus say Yuki. Yeah, I think Checo will be out, and I think he'll be replaced with Yuki or Liam.
Well, time will tell. And you talk about Carlos Sainz. Well, we don't know which driver Christian Horner was going to Williams to talk about for 2025, so you never know.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Know. I mean, right? I think he's so talented. I really do. I've always thought Carlos Sainz was so talented. But Carlos Sainz was in AlphaTauri. I don't know if maybe it was never on the table because he just didn't want to go back to that, or didn't want to go back into the program, kind of the Red Bull program or whatever. But I was kind of secretly hoping that might be an option. I think the dynamic between Carlos and Max is actually pretty entertaining. I think from a content standpoint for Red Bull, that could be a really good one. And I think he's a great driver. I really do. I think he's a great driver.
Absolutely. And, Red Bull needs two great drivers these days. So, as every team does, but maybe Red Bull didn't need last year. But they didn't call me. So, there we are. So, where can our listeners, as we bring it to a close, where can our listeners find you? And have you got anything you're looking forward to, coming up?
Yeah, so the listeners can find me on my X page, which is Dr_Obbs, Dr. Obbs. Also can be found on YouTube as well. I post a few videos and things like that, explainer videos on YouTube. You can also find me, Dr. Obbs, on Threads. I'm trying to be better about using my Threads. Never know where X is going to go with the madman at the helm. But Threads is there. I also have Instagram as well, that Dr. Obbs, that I also contribute to. You can also find me at Breaking Bias Podcast as well, YouTube page as well as X. Find us on Spotify, Breaking Bias, BRAKING. And what I'm really looking forward to is, number one, the close of the season. I'm very much looking forward to how the season's going to pan out. Very much looking forward to 2026 regulation set, seeing what the cars are going to look like. I think next year, people are already starting to make models like hobbyists, like myself and others are starting to make like 3D models. And we're trying to like convince some of them to put them into CFD so we can run some simulations. So we can already start to look at the aero of the 2026 car. So I'm definitely looking forward to that. But in the near term, on the Breaking Bias podcast, we just today got confirmation of one of our guests, which will remain a secret until they're out there in the open. But confirmation of acceptance of one of our guests that we've been trying to get on, and we will have a proper aerodynamic nerd out session. So I'm very much looking forward to that one.
Brilliant. Well, I can't wait to find out. And that's a great cliffhanger to leave it. So, we allowed you 2 plugs. I'll give you a third. If you want to find out who that guest's going to be, well, keep your eye on the Breaking Bias podcast page, because sooner or later they'll release their new episode. And you'll find out. And if you love aerodynamics, and if you're 1 hour and 10 into this episode, you probably do, then that'll be the episode for you. Well, look, guys, it's been a pleasure for me to talk to Dr. Obbs. We're recording this on a Friday night. I started the call feeling a bit, it's been a long week at work, but I leave it fully energized, and I don't know what I'm going to do with that energy. Maybe I'm going to be rewatching sprint qualifying. But look, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much for your time. Guys, if you've made it this far into the episode, give us a thumbs up, comment, tell us what you like, you don't like, tell us which guests you want next. But until next time, I've been F1 Blag. This has been Georgie's Stripping the Dipping podcast. Good night.